In the history of American slavery, countless stories of suffering, courage, and resilience have been told. Many of these stories focus on the well-documented cruelty inflicted by white male slave owners on enslaved people. These narratives are vital, shining a light on the systemic violence and oppression that defined a dark era of history. Yet, amid these widely known accounts, there exists another layer of the past that has remained largely hidden: the abuse that enslaved black men endured at the hands of white women. While it may be less discussed, its impact was profound and cannot be overlooked. Imagine the complex dynamics within a slaveholding household. Power was not limited to men alone. Women held a unique social authority that allowed them to enforce control in ways both subtle and overt. In these households, enslaved black men were subjected to forms of coercion and manipulation that could alter the course of their lives. The fear, confusion, and vulnerability they experienced were compounded by the social norms and racial hierarchies that surrounded them. A white woman's influence in the domestic sphere, often seen as benign or gentle, could mask a harsh reality of exploitation and domination. This chapter of history challenges the traditional narrative that often casts women solely as passive bystanders. Instead, it reveals how privilege and power, when unchecked, can manifest in harmful ways regardless of gender. For enslaved, navigating this environment meant facing threats that could include forced compliance, false accusations, and severe punishment. The psychological toll was immense, as the struggle to maintain dignity and agency became an everyday battle. Even the simple act of surviving another day carried weighty consequences for family and community life, shaping legacies that would persist long after slavery's official end. In exploring these stories, we gain a more complete understanding of slavery's multifaceted oppression. The experiences of enslaved black men under white female authority offer a perspective that is often missing in historical accounts. Their resilience, endurance, and the silent strength they displayed illuminate the full spectrum of human experience during this era. It is a story not of sensationalism, but of historical truth, demanding recognition and reflection. By sharing these narratives, we honor those whose voices were suppressed and invite a deeper conversation about history's overlooked corners. If you find these stories compelling, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to continue exploring the untold chapters of our past. Together, we can uncover the truths that history tried to hide and give voice to those who endured unimaginable hardships. In the shadowed corridors of plantation homes, the lives of enslaved black men were shaped not only by the overt cruelty of male slaveholders, but also by the subtle, and at times equally harrowing, authority wielded by white women. These women, often appearing as figures of refinement and gentleness to the outside world, carried within the domestic sphere a unique form of power that could dictate the course of another human being's existence. Unlike the violence that was physically imposed by men, the control exercised by white women often took the form of psychological manipulation, social leverage, and strategic exploitation, exploiting the dependence that enslaved men had for their daily survival and for any measure of safety within the household. This dynamic created an environment in which fear, uncertainty, and coercion became intertwined with the everyday routines of work, rest, and even fleeting moments of respite. Within the confines of kitchens, parlors, and hidden corners of the estate, white women could shape the fates of enslaved men with decisions that ranged from seemingly minor to life-altering. A man's access to food, clothing, or small mercies often depended on the whims or directives of the woman who oversaw domestic affairs. While men enforced rules through threat and punishment, women wielded influence through the subtle orchestration of household systems, sometimes rewarding compliance and at other times meting out punishment under the guise of propriety or concern. This power was complicated by the social norms of the time, which not only shielded white women from scrutiny but also allowed them to manipulate perceptions, framing their actions as either innocent or charitable, while the consequences for the enslaved could be severe. The tension between outward civility and underlying control created a landscape where enslaved men had to navigate not only physical labor but also the intricate, often invisible, social hierarchies within the home. The exploitation of dependence was perhaps the most insidious aspect of this authority. Enslaved men were placed in positions where survival often required negotiation, acquiescence, or the delicate balance of compliance with the woman's expectations. Requests or commands from a white woman could carry implications that extended far beyond the immediate moment, influencing a man's reputation among other enslaved people, his treatment by overseers, and sometimes even his physical safety. Refusal or hesitation could be met with punishment, rumors, or the leveraging of false accusations, creating a system in which the very act of maintaining dignity required constant vigilance, intuition, and strategic self-restraint. In many, the household became a site of tension in which power and vulnerability were constantly recalibrated, a space where the consequences of misjudgment could ripple outward in ways both immediate and long-lasting. This environment of dependence and manipulation was not merely about control for its own sake. It reflected the broader social and economic structures that underpinned slavery. White women, often confined to the domestic sphere themselves by cultural and legal restrictions, exercised the authority available to them with precision, enforcing social hierarchies that extended beyond their personal desires. In doing, they became active participants in a system designed to subjugate, dehumanize, and extract labor from an entire population. The experiences of enslaved men under this form of power were multifaceted. The psychological strain of anticipating commands, the constant awareness of potential repercussions, and the need to navigate interactions with care all created an environment of sustained tension. Yet within this oppressive framework, many enslaved men developed strategies of survival, learning to read subtle cues, anticipate moods, and maneuver within the constraints imposed upon them. Their resilience in the face of such complex forms of control speaks to a remarkable endurance and resourcefulness, qualities that history too often overlooks. It is important to recognize that the stories of these men are inseparable from the broader context of slavery's pervasive cruelty. The authority exercised by white women did not exist in isolation. It was part of an intricate network of power in which every action, gesture, and decision reinforced the systemic oppression that defined the era. By understanding this dynamic, we gain insight into the full spectrum of control and abuse that shaped the daily lives of enslaved people, revealing a layer of history that challenges simplified narratives of victimhood and villainy. These accounts illuminate the ways in which power, privilege, and gender intersected within the institution of slavery, showing that oppression was a shared enterprise, perpetuated by many actors in different forms and through varied methods. As we explore these narratives, we are called to acknowledge the complexity of human behavior in a world structured by injustice. The resilience, strategy, and quiet resistance displayed by enslaved men under the authority of white women offer a deeper appreciation for their endurance and humanity, even in the most constrained circumstances. Recognizing these stories is not merely an academic exercise. It is a commitment to remembering the full breadth of experiences that slavery entailed, honoring those whose voices were silenced, and ensuring that history reflects the multifaceted realities of those who lived through it. The shadows of the plantation held more than the weight of physical labor and harsh discipline. They concealed a grim reality of coercion that permeated every corner of enslaved life, particularly in the interactions between black men and the white women who wielded domestic authority. In households where power was already a currency controlled by social standing and race, the dependence of enslaved men on their daily work, their food, and their relative safety became a tool for exploitation. What might have appeared outwardly as routine tasks or casual commands often carried a darker undertone, a latent threat that refusal to comply could trigger consequences far beyond the immediate moment. The complexities of these relationships were shrouded in silence, as the very act of questioning or resisting authority could place an individual in mortal danger. Within this context, sexual coercion emerged as one of the most harrowing manifestations of control, an instrument through which power could be enforced invisibly yet inexorably. For many enslaved men, the boundaries between survival and subjugation were cruelly blurred. A single act of resistance could provoke violent retaliation, ranging from physical punishment to public shaming, and in the most extreme instances, death. The enforcement of compliance was often subtle, cloaked in the veneer of domestic oversight or social expectation, but the consequences were anything but hidden. In the private spaces of the household, where eyes could observe but voices dared not speak, white women were able to manipulate both authority and perception, creating a precarious environment in which enslaved men were forced to navigate a maze of implied demands and veiled threats. The power dynamics were further complicated by societal narratives that simultaneously fetishized, demonized, and dehumanized black men, leaving them trapped in a system where their humanity could be disregarded with impunity. The psychological toll of this coercion was immense, as men were compelled to reconcile their own sense of dignity and identity with the brutal realities imposed upon them. The daily calculations of whom to trust, how to act, and when to remain silent became a survival mechanism, a quiet resistance against the complete erosion of autonomy. Refusal was rarely a viable option, as the repercussions could ripple through every aspect of life, affecting not only the individual but also their family and community, creating a network of fear and control that reinforced the institution of slavery itself. These dynamics illustrate the intersection of gender, race, and power in a system designed to perpetuate oppression, revealing how authority could be wielded not only through overt violence but also through calculated manipulation of dependence and vulnerability. The experiences of enslaved men under such coercion also challenge conventional narratives of victimhood, showing that oppression was not monolithic but multifaceted, encompassing physical, psychological, and social dimensions. While the historical record often emphasizes the brutalities inflicted by male slaveholders, the subtle, pervasive control exercised by white women in the household demanded equal recognition for the profound suffering it produced. The men who endured these pressures developed strategies to survive, employing discretion, patience, and keen observation to navigate the invisible boundaries that dictated behavior. Their resilience in the face of such insidious forms of domination underscores the complex interplay between survival, resistance, and imposed power, revealing layers of history that are often overlooked. These encounters were rarely recorded, leaving a legacy of silence that has made this aspect of history particularly difficult to uncover. What survives in diaries, letters, and the rare testimonies of those who lived through these experiences provides only glimpses into the fear, anguish, and constrained agency that define daily existence. Yet even these fragments illuminate the mechanisms through which control was maintained, offering insight into the ways in which dependence and coercion were exploited to enforce compliance and reinforce social hierarchies. The enforced proximity and the intimate nature of domestic spaces magnified the stakes, making every interaction a potential test of endurance, a delicate negotiation between self-preservation and the recognition of imposed power. Understanding this facet of history allows us to appreciate the full scope of the systemic cruelty of slavery, as well as the strength and ingenuity required to navigate such an environment. The stories of enslaved black men, silenced for so long, reveal not only the horrors they endured but also the depth of their resilience. the subtle strategies of resistance, and the ways in which they preserved their sense of self under relentless pressure. By examining these narratives, we gain a more nuanced understanding of how power, coercion, and vulnerability intersected within the domestic sphere, creating a reality in which survival demanded both courage and careful calculation. These accounts challenge us to recognize the multifaceted nature of oppression, and to honor the endurance of those whose voices history has often left unheard, reminding us that the legacies of the past are complex, painful, and deeply instructive. Throughout the era of slavery, the lives of enslaved black men were shaped not only by the direct actions of those who held them in bondage, but also by the pervasive myths and societal narratives that surrounded them, weaving a complex web of oppression that extended far beyond the physical realm. These narratives often painted black men as inherently hypersexual, aggressive, and physically dominant, traits that were grossly exaggerated and weaponized to serve the interests of white supremacy. In the hands of those who wielded power, particularly within the domestic sphere, such myths became tools for justifying control, coercion, and abuse while simultaneously silencing the very victims they targeted. The portrayal of black men as dangerous or uncontrollable allowed both men and women in positions of authority to manipulate fear, social perception, and legal frameworks, ensuring that the lives of enslaved individuals were circumscribed by suspicion and constant surveillance. In the plantations and households where these dynamics played out, enslaved men found themselves navigating a precarious environment in which every gesture, word, and glance could carry profound consequences. The false assumptions surrounding their supposed hypersexuality were not merely abstract ideas. They were actively employed to rationalize actions that ranged from psychological manipulation to outright coercion. For white women, these myths provided a convenient shield, enabling behaviors that exploited dependence while deflecting scrutiny and moral accountability. The system implied that any encounter could be interpreted as a threat or a provocation, casting the enslaved man as guilty in a narrative preordained by societal prejudice, resistance, or denial. Therefore, was fraught with peril, as refusal to comply with imposed demands could be reframed as aggression or misconduct, feeding back into the very myths used to control him. This manipulation of perception had profound consequences for both the victims and the broader enslaved community. Enslaved men were compelled to constantly manage how they were perceived, carefully modulating their actions to avoid triggering false accusations that could result in punishment, exile, or even death. The strategies of self-preservation required subtlety, intuition, and a deep understanding of the social hierarchies that dictated every interaction. Meanwhile, the myths themselves entrenched a system in which voices of truth were suppressed, and testimony from black men about abuse or coercion was often disbelieved, dismissed, or outright ignored. In this way, the distortion of character and intent became a powerful method of oppression, reinforcing a cycle in which exploitation could continue unchecked while the victims' suffering remained invisible to the wider society. Within the domestic sphere, the psychological dimension of this control was as significant as the physical. White women, entrusted with the management of households and the enforcement of social decorum, could leverage these stereotypes to maintain authority, often manipulating fear, dependency, and social stigma to extract compliance. Enslaved men were caught in a web of conflicting imperatives. To survive, they had to navigate the fine line between obedience and assertion of dignity, all while contending with the false narratives that framed them as inherently threatening or morally suspect. Each interaction carried the weight of this inherited prejudice, making even the simplest daily task a complex negotiation between self-preservation and imposed vulnerability. The impact of these myths extended beyond individual experiences, shaping the social structure of enslaved communities and influencing the dynamics of trust, solidarity, and resistance. False narratives about hypersexuality and physical dominance were not confined to isolated interactions. They permeated the legal, social, and cultural frameworks of the time, affecting how enslaved men were treated by overseers, neighbors, and institutions. These distortions made it easier to enforce compliance, to instill fear, and to delegitimize any claims of mistreatment, creating an environment in which systemic abuse could continue without accountability. The psychological weight of constantly contending with misrepresentation added a layer of trauma that intertwined with the physical hardships of slavery, shaping the inner lives and strategies of those forced to endure such oppression. Yet, even under the heavy shadow of these myths, the resilience and agency of enslaved black men persisted. Survival demanded not only endurance but also the ability to navigate an intricate maze of social signals and cultural expectations. Many developed methods of subtle resistance, finding ways to assert their humanity and maintain dignity in circumstances that sought to strip them of both. Their experiences illuminate the ways in which prejudice and false narratives were weaponized to maintain power, but they also reveal the quiet strength and ingenuity that allowed individuals to endure and, in small but meaningful ways, resist the structures designed to oppress them. By examining how myths of hypersexuality and dominance were exploited to justify abuse, we gain a deeper understanding of the multifaceted nature of slavery's oppression. These stories remind us that the consequences of prejudice extend far beyond the surface, shaping daily life, interpersonal dynamics, and the very possibilities for survival within an unjust system. The narratives of enslaved black men, often silenced or distorted, offer crucial insight into how power, perception, and societal narratives intersected to enforce control and perpetuate suffering. Recognizing this dimension of history not only honors the resilience of those who endured it, but also challenges us to confront the enduring legacies of myth and stereotype that continue to influence perceptions of race, power, and justice. In the fraught and violent world of slavery, the imbalances of power extended far beyond the fields and into the most intimate corners of daily life, shaping social norms, legal codes, and cultural perceptions in ways that reinforced oppression at every turn. While the brutal exploitation of enslaved women by white men has been extensively documented and, tragically, often normalized in both historical records and contemporary memory, the experiences of enslaved black men under the scrutiny of white women occupied a far more precarious and perilous position. Within the rigidly constructed hierarchies of the time, relationships between white women and black men, whether forced, coerced, or imagined through the lens of rumor, were immediately framed as scandalous and criminal. A stark inversion of the power dynamics that allowed white men's abuse to persist with impunity. The system itself reinforced these contradictions, creating an environment in which the victims of coercion were rendered silent, while the perpetrators of similar or even greater violence faced little to no accountability. A cruel irony that underscored the pervasive injustice of slavery. Enslaved men were caught in a world where survival depended on their careful navigation of these double standards, where the slightest misstep or misinterpreted gesture could have devastating consequences. White women's perceived virtue and social standing were protected by law and custom, and any suggestion of impropriety involving a black man was treated not merely as a social transgression but as a criminal act that could justify extreme punishment, including imprisonment, flogging, or execution. The same acts, if committed by a white man toward an enslaved woman, were often minimized, excused, or ignored entirely, a reflection of deeply entrenched racial and gender hierarchies that sanctioned power and denied accountability. This stark contrast created a climate of fear and uncertainty, where enslaved men were forced to carefully calibrate every interaction, balancing the instinct for self-preservation against the impossibility of asserting full agency within a system designed to deny it. The implications of this unequal enforcement of morality were far-reaching, touching not only individual lives but also the social fabric of enslaved communities. Men who were falsely accused or coerced into situations framed as criminal faced repercussions that rippled through families, friendships, and community networks, undermining trust and amplifying the psychological burden of daily life. The pervasive myths that cast black men as inherently dangerous or hypersexual were reinforced by this legal and social double standard, further justifying the extreme measures taken against them while simultaneously obscuring the systemic abuse committed by white men. In this context, every aspect of interaction between enslaved men and white women became a fraught negotiation of survival, where social perception was as dangerous a force as any overseer's whip. The normalization of abuse by white men also contributed to the invisibility of male victims, as society was conditioned to view women exclusively as the vulnerable party and men as aggressors. Regardless of circumstance, enslaved black men were denied the ability to claim victimhood without risking their lives, while white women could manipulate social and legal structures to protect themselves and maintain authority. The imbalance of consequence created a vicious cycle in which silence became a necessity, fostering an environment in which exploitation could persist without scrutiny, and where the psychological trauma of navigating these dangers was compounded by isolation and fear. Men learned to internalize these pressures, developing strategies for endurance and cautious interaction that required constant vigilance and an acute understanding of human behavior and social nuance. This disparity between normalized abuse and criminalized relations reflects not only the prejudices of the time but also the broader mechanisms through which slavery maintained its power. By controlling the narratives of morality, propriety, and social order, the system simultaneously justified the exploitation of enslaved women and vilified black men, reinforcing racial hierarchies and protecting the social standing of white women. The legal and cultural frameworks worked in tandem, codifying fear and dependency while leaving enslaved men with little recourse and few allies. Their lives were defined by the tension between imposed authority and the instinct for self-preservation, an ever-present balancing act where miscalculation could result in irreversible consequences. Yet even within these constraints, enslaved men exhibited remarkable resilience and adaptability. They learned to navigate the treacherous waters of perception and power, employing subtle forms of resistance and calculated compliance to survive under oppressive conditions. Their strategies were often unrecorded, hidden in the silence that the system demanded, yet they reveal a profound understanding of the social and psychological terrain in which they were forced to operate. The interplay between normalized male dominance and the criminalization of male victimhood underscores the complex and insidious ways that slavery manipulated both law and perception to maintain control, leaving a legacy of trauma and injustice that echoes far beyond the immediate context of the plantations. Examining these dynamics allows us to see the full spectrum of oppression and the intricate web of power, race, and gender that governed life under slavery. It highlights the courage, resourcefulness, and enduring humanity of enslaved men who survived in a world designed to erase their autonomy and silence their voices. By understanding the contradictions and injustices embedded in these historical structures, we gain insight into the mechanisms of systemic exploitation and the extraordinary resilience required to navigate a society in which one's very existence could be criminalized, coerced, and manipulated at every turn. Within the oppressive world of slavery, the precarious existence of enslaved black men was shaped not only by direct coercion and exploitation, but also by the ever-present threat of false accusation, a peril that could transform moments of vulnerability into matters of life and death. The domestic sphere, where white women exercised considerable authority over the daily routines and survival of enslaved men, was often the site of this insidious dynamic. In these spaces, acts of coercion, manipulation, or abuse could be concealed under the veneer of propriety. Yet the power imbalance inherent in the social and legal structures of the time meant that any exposure carried the potential for devastating consequences. A white woman who had engaged in abusive behavior, whether motivated by desire, power, or social positioning, could, if challenged or compromised, redirect suspicion onto the very men she had exploited, framing them as aggressors and invoking a system that treated their alleged actions with swift and often lethal severity. The consequences of such accusations were extreme and unyielding. Enslaved men accused of assault by white women faced the full weight of a society eager to punish transgression while absolving white actors of responsibility. Executions, lynchings, or the imposition of harsher labor and living conditions became tools of enforcement, not merely for the individual accused, but as a warning to the entire enslaved community. The immediacy of such punishments left little room for defense or appeal, reinforcing the pervasive atmosphere of fear and subjugation that defined life on the plantations. Every interaction between enslaved men and white women carried a latent risk, a silent calculation of how actions, words, or even gestures could be interpreted, weaponized, and used to justify retribution. Survival required not only endurance but an acute awareness of perception and consequence, a constant balancing act that tested both courage and cunning. This mechanism of accusation was deeply entwined with broader societal narratives and legal structures that codified racial and gender hierarchies. The myth of black male hypersexuality and inherent threat was amplified in these cases, providing justification for extreme measures while obscuring the abuse inflicted by those in positions of privilege. White women, protected by both social status and law, could manipulate these narratives to shield themselves from accountability, transforming themselves from potential perpetrators into unquestioned arbiters of morality. The lives of enslaved men were thus caught in a cruel paradox. The very authority and power they sought to navigate for survival could be turned against them, creating a system in which compliance offered no guarantee of safety and resistance carried the weight of mortal peril. The psychological toll of this dynamic cannot be overstated. Enslaved men lived under a constant shadow of suspicion, acutely aware that any misstep could be seized upon and recast as justification for punishment. Every interaction, every moment of perceived intimacy, and every act of compliance had the potential to be scrutinized and distorted, leaving men to manage not only physical labor but also the invisible terrain of fear, perception, and reputation. The strategies of survival were as much about navigating social and psychological landscapes as they were about enduring physical hardship, requiring a combination of restraint, observation, and strategic engagement. These unrecorded negotiations, subtle yet vital, illustrate the depth of insight and resilience that enslaved men cultivated in order to preserve life and dignity in circumstances designed to strip them of both. At the same time, the possibility of false accusation reinforced the structural power of slavery in ways that extended beyond the immediate consequences for the accused. It served as a tool of social control, reminding the entire enslaved population of the consequences of perceived transgression and the limits of personal autonomy. Families, communities, and networks of trust were shaped and constrained by this ever-present risk, influencing behavior, relationships, and strategies for collective survival. The threat of being falsely accused or punished operated not only as a deterrent, but also as a method of psychological domination, maintaining hierarchies through fear and reinforcing dependence on the system that simultaneously oppressed and regulated every aspect of life. This pattern of manipulation and coercion, in which white women could exploit their social and legal protections to shield themselves while exposing enslaved men to extreme punishment, reveals a layer of slavery's cruelty that is often overlooked. The intersection of gender, race, and power created a landscape in which abuse, accusation, and punishment were inextricably linked, and where survival demanded constant vigilance and strategic foresight. The stories of men who navigated these dangers offer a profound testament to resilience, endurance, and ingenuity, highlighting the human capacity to survive under circumstances designed to erase agency and dignity. By examining this dimension of history, we gain a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of control and oppression that shaped the lives of enslaved people. The fear of accusation, the manipulation of societal narratives, and the pervasive imbalance of power underscore the complexity of slavery as an institution, revealing how legal, social, and psychological forces intersected to maintain dominance. The resilience demonstrated by enslaved men in response to these pressures is a testament not only to their fortitude, but also to the broader human capacity to navigate, endure, and resist oppression, even in the most constrained and perilous conditions. These narratives remind us that the history of slavery encompasses not only overt brutality, but also the subtle, pervasive forms of control that dictated behavior, constrained agency, and inflicted lasting trauma on those who lived under its shadow. The lived experience of enslaved black men was a continuous negotiation between survival and the relentless imposition of power, a struggle that extended far beyond physical labor into the very essence of personhood, identity, and dignity. While historical accounts often emphasize the brutality inflicted by overseers or male slaveholders, a deeper understanding emerges when we examine how enslaved men were systematically denied control over their own bodies and lives, stripped of agency in ways that extended into the most intimate aspects of daily existence. In the confines of households, fields, and quarters, the mechanisms of control operated on multiple levels, intertwining physical violence, psychological manipulation, and social coercion to enforce an unyielding hierarchy. The consequences were not only immediate but enduring, shaping the contours of experience, perception, and survival in a society structured to deny black men both autonomy and recognition. The humiliation of losing bodily autonomy was a constant undercurrent in the lives of enslaved men, seeping into every interaction and shaping the rhythms of daily life. Simple acts movement through the household, access to food, the ability to speak freely, or the expression of emotion were circumscribed by invisible lines of authority that could be enforced without recourse. In domestic spaces, white women exercised authority with a subtle yet potent influence, leveraging societal norms, personal reputation, and legal protections to assert dominance. Every decision they made, from tasks assigned to the distribution of resources, reinforced the message that enslaved men existed not as individuals with agency but as objects to be managed, controlled, and disciplined according to the priorities of those in power. The psychological burden of constant surveillance, combined with the fear of accusation or punishment, created an environment where self-expression and self-determination were perpetually constrained, leaving men to navigate a treacherous landscape of dependence, threat, and strategic compliance. Sexual coercion added a particularly cruel dimension to this denial of autonomy, transforming private spaces into arenas where the control over one's body became contested terrain. Many enslaved men were compelled into relations that they neither desired nor consented to, and refusal often carried the gravest of consequences. Physical punishment, social ostracism, or even death. The intersection of power, race, and gender magnified these abuses, as prevailing myths about black men's supposed hypersexuality were deployed to rationalize exploitation while simultaneously framing any resistance as deviance or aggression. In this way, the manipulation of perception and narrative became as potent a tool of subjugation as physical violence, ensuring that the denial of agency extended not only into the body but also into social, legal, and cultural dimensions of life. The erosion of autonomy was not merely a matter of physical control, but also of psychological and emotional subjugation. Enslaved men were forced to contend with a system that stripped them of the ability to make meaningful choices. From the labor they performed to the very manner in which they could interact with others. Every gesture, glance, or word could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or weaponized, creating an unrelenting pressure to conform, to anticipate, and to survive within an environment where the stakes were always life and death. These conditions demanded extraordinary resilience and adaptability, as men devised strategies to navigate authority, preserve dignity, and maintain bonds of community while constrained by the constant threat of punishment or coercion. In these acts of quiet endurance, the inner lives of enslaved men reveal a remarkable capacity for psychological navigation, a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics, and a steadfast determination to maintain a measure of humanity under circumstances designed to deny it. The social consequences of this stripping of agency were profound, rippling through families, communities, and interpersonal relationships. Men who were coerced, accused, or punished faced not only immediate harm, but also the fracturing of familial and communal bonds, as the structures of slavery deliberately undermined trust, solidarity, and collective resilience. The mechanisms of control reinforced hierarchies and dependence, shaping behavior and constraining possibility while embedding fear into the fabric of everyday life. Yet, even in these conditions, enslaved men cultivated methods of subtle resistance, asserting control where possible, negotiating relationships with both caution and insight, and finding ways to preserve identity and autonomy in the margins where it was still attainable. Understanding the full impact of this deprivation of bodily and social autonomy requires situating these experiences within the broader dynamics of slavery. The abuse of power exercised by white men and women alike, the strategic manipulation of myths and social perceptions, and the legal and cultural frameworks that protected perpetrators while criminalizing victims all converged to create a system in which autonomy was a rare and fragile commodity. Within this oppressive matrix, every decision carried weight, every moment of survival demanded strategy, and every act of endurance became an assertion of humanity in the face of deliberate dehumanization. By exploring these narratives, we gain insight into the multidimensional nature of oppression and the resilience it demanded. The experiences of enslaved black men, enduring physical violence, coercion, and the systematic denial of agency, illuminate the complex interplay of power, fear, and resistance that characterized slavery. These stories remind us that the impact of oppression is not only immediate but enduring, affecting identity, relationships, and the very capacity to exercise choice. The resilience, adaptability, and quiet resistance demonstrated by enslaved men in response to these constraints reveal not only the severity of their suffering, but also the extraordinary strength required to survive within a system designed to deny both life and dignity, leaving a legacy that continues to inform our understanding of justice, autonomy, and human endurance. The historical record of slavery is filled with accounts of unimaginable suffering, courage, and endurance. Yet it is also marked by silences that speak volumes about who had the power to be heard and who was denied a voice. Among the most overlooked are the experiences of enslaved black men, whose stories of coercion, abuse, and exploitation were rarely recorded or acknowledged, leaving gaps in the understanding of slavery's full impact, while narratives of enslaved women, particularly in the context of sexual violence by white male slaveholders, have been documented through diaries, letters, and later testimonies. The experiences of male victims were often rendered invisible by a society structured to silence them. This absence was not incidental. It reflected the intersection of racial prejudice, gender norms, and systemic oppression, all of which conspired to deny black men the possibility of telling their own stories. Enslaved men lived under a constant, crushing weight of control, where daily survival demanded navigating complex social hierarchies and invisible threats. The coercion imposed by both male and female authority figures extended into the most private realms of existence, from bodily autonomy to the manipulation of perception and reputation. Yet, unlike women whose suffering, while also brutal, was sometimes preserved in written or oral testimony, black men were deprived not only of their autonomy but also of the means to document their pain. Their experiences were filtered through the perspectives of others, overseers, owners, or historians, often stripped of nuance and reinterpreted to fit prevailing narratives that emphasized male dominance. White virtue, or societal propriety. In this way, the erasure of black men's voices became both a consequence and a mechanism of their oppression, perpetuating a cycle in which their suffering was acknowledged only insofar as it could be framed by those in power. The implications of this enforced silence were profound. Enslaved men who endured coercion, forced labor, sexual exploitation, or the constant threat of false accusation were left to navigate trauma without public acknowledgement. Legal recourse, or historical validation. In households where white women wielded domestic authority, the stakes were especially high. Acts of abuse could be concealed, and if exposure threatened social or personal standing, the men themselves could be recast as aggressors, punished, or even executed. The absence of their testimonies in historical records does not indicate that these abuses were rare or insignificant. On the contrary, it underscores the deliberate mechanisms by which society erased male victimhood, ensuring that the lens through which slavery was remembered emphasized other narratives while concealing this particular dimension of suffering. The silencing of black male voices also had psychological and communal ramifications. Without the opportunity to speak openly or seek validation, men were forced to internalize fear, shame, and trauma, carrying the weight of experiences that were often unspeakable in both private and public contexts. Within enslaved communities, the absence of formal recognition of these abuses affected relationships, trust, and social cohesion, as men had to navigate interactions with both caution and strategy to avoid compounding the dangers imposed by those in authority. Every gesture, every act, compliance or resistance, was subject to interpretation, making survival an ongoing exercise in judgment, discretion, and calculated behavior, the strategies they developed to endure subtle forms of resistance. Careful observation and the cultivation of self-preservation skills reveal the extraordinary resilience and adaptability required to exist under such conditions. Historical myths and societal perceptions further reinforced this erasure. Black men were often stereotyped as hypersexual or inherently aggressive, narratives that were manipulated to justify abuse, mask coercion, and to dismiss the possibility of male victimhood. These myths not only distorted public understanding but also intensified the dangers faced by enslaved men, creating a framework in which speaking out could be fatal or interpreted as confirmation of the false stereotypes imposed upon them. The intersection of race, gender, and power thus operated on multiple levels. Constraining agency, shaping behavior, and silencing voices, leaving a historical record that only partially reflects the reality of those who endured slavery's full weight. The scarcity of first-person accounts from black male victims also challenges modern historians and storytellers to read between the lines of available documentation, seeking traces of experience in legal records, plantation correspondence, and the rare testimonies that survived. Each fragment provides a glimpse into the psychological, social, and physical dimensions of oppression, revealing the intricate strategies men employed to navigate coercion, preserve dignity, and maintain connection to family and community under conditions designed to strip them of both. These narratives, when pieced together, illuminate the depth of resilience and resourcefulness that characterized the lives of enslaved black men, highlighting the ways in which survival often required as much psychological acumen as physical endurance. Acknowledging this historical silence is not merely an academic exercise but a moral imperative, as it challenges simplified or incomplete understandings of slavery and emphasizes the need to consider the full spectrum of human experience. By recognizing that black male victims were systematically denied the chance to record or testify about their suffering, we gain insight into the mechanisms of erasure and control that defined the institution of slavery. It also allows us to honor the resilience, intelligence, and enduring humanity of those who lived under its shadow, whose survival demanded navigating a world in which their voices were intentionally suppressed. These stories, reconstructed and remembered, remind us that history is not only what has been documented but also what has been silenced, and that the task of understanding the past requires careful attention to both the voices we have and those we must recover. The impact of slavery on enslaved black men extended far beyond the immediate and brutal imposition of labor. Physical punishment and coerced sexual encounters, reaching deeply into the structures of family, community, and personal identity, leaving scars that often lasted across generations. In a system designed to strip agency, autonomy, and dignity, men were not only denied control over their own bodies but also over the lives and well-being of their loved ones, creating fractures that resonated through households and kinship networks. The constant threat of abuse, false accusation, or violent retaliation meant that men lived in perpetual tension between protecting themselves and protecting those around them. Yet the mechanisms of slavery made meaningful protection nearly impossible. Within this context, the horrors of domestic coercion, manipulation, and systemic oppression converged to undermine the most fundamental bonds of trust and care, leaving families vulnerable and men powerless in ways that were both immediate and enduring. In households where white women exercised authority, the stakes were particularly acute, as coercion could take forms that men could neither anticipate nor resist without grave risk. A single misstep, a misunderstood gesture, or even the perception of impropriety could expose men to punishment or fatal reprisal, while also imperiling their family members, whose survival was inextricably tied to their behavior. Enslaved fathers, brothers, and sons were forced to navigate a treacherous landscape in which the assertion of dignity or resistance could have consequences far beyond themselves, fracturing family cohesion and eroding the capacity to safeguard loved ones. The psychological toll of living under such conditions was immense, as men carried the weight of constant vigilance, fear, and moral compromise, aware that even carefully calculated actions could fail to prevent harm to those they cared for. The denial of agency extended into the heart of family life, rendering men unable to intervene when loved ones were subjected to abuse, sale, or separation. Plantation structures, legal codes, and social norms deliberately undermined familial bonds, treating relationships as secondary to the economic and social imperatives of ownership. Enslaved men could witness the suffering of their spouses, children, and siblings, yet remain constrained by the reality that intervention might provoke harsher consequences, not only for themselves but also for their entire household. This enforced helplessness transformed everyday life into a delicate balance of endurance, strategy, and the constant weighing of risk against necessity, leaving families in a state of persistent vulnerability and emotional strain. The fracturing of families was compounded by the broader social and cultural narratives that justified and normalized exploitation while criminalizing resistance. Myths portraying black men as hypersexual or inherently dangerous were strategically employed to rationalize abuse and silence victims, reinforcing the perception that men were incapable of responsible action or moral judgment. These stereotypes were weaponized to amplify fear and control, making it socially acceptable and often legally sanctioned to punish black men for transgressions they did not commit while simultaneously excusing or concealing the abuses of white men and women. Within this framework, enslaved families were caught in a web of oppression that constrained emotional connection, disrupted caregiving, and limited the possibility of communal support, all of which magnified the trauma inflicted by coercion and violence. Despite these formidable barriers, enslaved men sought ways to protect and sustain their families, employing ingenuity, discretion, and resilience in the face of systemic obstacles. Small acts of care ensuring that children were fed, shielding siblings from certain forms of labor, or conveying messages of support and warning represented crucial strategies of resistance and preservation within the constraints imposed by slavery. These efforts, though often imperceptible to outsiders, reflect the deep commitment to familial bonds and the profound resourcefulness required to maintain some measure of agency in circumstances designed to erase it. Even in the face of overwhelming power disparities, these acts of protection and endurance allowed families to survive, if not wholly intact, then at least as units of shared memory, strength, and resilience. The long-term effects of this enforced powerlessness resonate across generations. As the trauma of separation, abuse, and helplessness became embedded in family histories and collective memory, enslaved men's inability to fully protect their loved ones reinforced the enduring psychological and social consequences of slavery. Shaping identity, interpersonal relationships, and community structures for years to come, these fractures illustrate how the institution of slavery operated not merely through overt violence, but also through the systematic erosion of agency. Emotional security and familial stability, demonstrating that the consequences of oppression extended far beyond the immediate moment and into the very fabric of social and personal life. By examining the ways in which enslaved men were denied the capacity to safeguard their families, we gain a fuller understanding of the multidimensional impact of slavery. It underscores how the intertwining of power, fear, and coercion permeated every level of existence, shaping relationships and social structures while demanding extraordinary resilience and ingenuity. The stories of men who endured these conditions reveal not only the pervasive cruelty of the system, but also the enduring strength, love, and resourcefulness that allowed families to survive despite systemic attempts to fracture and control them. In recognizing this, we honor the complexity of their experiences, the depth of their endurance, and the resilience required to maintain connections in a world that sought to sever them, leaving a legacy of both profound suffering and remarkable fortitude. As we reflect on the hidden dimensions of slavery, it becomes clear that the stories of enslaved black men, particularly regarding sexual coercion and abuse, have been systematically overlooked, not only in historical documentation, but also in the collective memory that shapes how we understand the past today. While the brutality inflicted on enslaved women has been recorded and studied, the suffering of men has often been erased, distorted, or silenced, leaving gaps in our comprehension of the full scope of slavery's horrors. This erasure is not incidental. It reflects broader patterns in which narratives are selectively preserved to reinforce existing power structures, allowing certain truths to remain invisible while others are amplified to fit societal expectations and comfort zones. The consequences of this selective remembrance are profound, affecting how history is taught, understood, and internalized, and influencing contemporary conversations about race, gender, and power. The experiences of enslaved black men were shaped by intersecting forms of oppression. The physical demands of labor, the constant threat of coercion or punishment, and the psychological weight of navigating social hierarchies that rendered them vulnerable to exploitation. Sexual violence, in particular, was weaponized as a tool of control, but unlike the accounts of women's suffering, few records exist that center the voices of male victims. This lack of documentation does not mean that such abuses were rare. On the contrary, it highlights the ways in which societal narratives and historical silencing have obscured these experiences. Black men were often left powerless not only in the moment of abuse, but also in the historical record. Their suffering mediated through the perspectives of those in positions of authority or interpreted through prejudiced assumptions that cast men as aggressors rather than victims. By acknowledging this erasure, we begin to understand the mechanisms by which slavery's sexual violence was remembered or deliberately forgotten. The myths of black male hypersexuality, the criminalization of men for interactions with white women, and the selective attention given to certain narratives all serve to protect white supremacy, while marginalizing the voices of those who endured it. These patterns of selective memory have persisted into modern scholarship and popular understanding, influencing the ways in which the histories of slavery are told, whose experiences are centered, and whose suffering is rendered invisible. Recognizing the absence of male voices is therefore not just an exercise in historical accuracy. It is a moral imperative that challenges us to confront the full complexity of oppression and to honor the humanity and resilience of those whose stories were denied a platform. The personal and communal consequences of this erasure are immense. Enslaved men were deprived not only of autonomy and protection but also of validation, testimony, and acknowledgement. Their inability to document or speak openly about abuse compounded the trauma, leaving wounds that extended beyond the individual to families and communities. Generationally, the silence surrounding male victimhood has contributed to ongoing misunderstandings about the dynamics of slavery, race, and power, making it even more critical to recover, reconstruct, and reflect on these hidden narratives by piecing together fragments from legal records, correspondence, rare testimonies, and historical analysis. We can begin to illuminate these stories, giving voice to experiences long denied recognition and honoring the resilience that allowed men to endure in the face of systemic dehumanization. Understanding this history also invites us to reconsider contemporary conversations about sexual violence, consent, and power. The legacies of slavery are not confined to the past. They echo in modern dynamics of racial inequality, gendered expectations, and societal perceptions of vulnerability and authority. Recognizing how black male victimhood was silenced offers critical insight into the ways in which societal structures continue to shape whose voices are heard, whose suffering is acknowledged, and whose experiences are validated. It challenges us to critically examine narratives of power, morality, and justice, and to advocate for inclusivity and honesty in the ways we document and interpret both history and present realities. In remembering the experiences of enslaved black men, we honor their resilience, intelligence, and courage, acknowledging the full spectrum of oppression they endured while celebrating their perseverance. These narratives remind us that the history of slavery encompasses far more than the stories that have been widely told. It includes hidden lives, silenced voices, and the extraordinary strength required to survive under relentless coercion and systemic injustice. By shining a light on these overlooked experiences, we contribute to a more complete understanding of history, ensuring that the complexities of oppression and the humanity of its victims are recognized and remembered. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this difficult but important history. Your attention helps ensure that the silenced voices of the past are acknowledged and honored. If you found this discussion meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share the channel so that we can continue uncovering and preserving these essential stories for future generations. Your support helps keep history alive and visible, giving voice to those who were denied it for far too long.